Well, the paper of record is trying to set the record straight. Hi, I'm Scott Ott with Stephen Green and Bill Whittle, and this episode of Right Angles brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. And gentlemen, the New York Times, the Gray Lady, the paper of record, the leader of all journalism in the United States, ran a story in their Sunday Review issue that was an excerpt from a book written by two of their reporters who have published this book. A lot of New York Times reporters have published books. And in it, they recount a story told by a Washington attorney named Max Stier, who said that he told the FBI that he was at a college party and Brett Kavanaugh, who's now a Supreme Court justice, had his trousers unzipped, and somehow, through some help from his friends, he came into contact with a woman's hand in a way that would be deemed inappropriate by almost everybody in the country. I'm not going to go into details about how all that happened. Really, this story isn't about Brett Kavanaugh. It's about the New York Times. Stephen Green, the Times has since had to acknowledge that it left out what might be called exculpatory evidence related to that incident that was actually reported in the book by its own reporters who said, oh, by the way, not only does the woman in question not have any memory of the incident, she doesn't want to talk about it, but they left that out of the newspaper story. Now, one of those reporters, who said it wasn't her decision, Steve, it was an editor's decision, is actually defending the Times by weekly saying, well, you know, maybe that part got cut out because they were late, it was going to deadline, and they just tried to remove the name of the woman from the excerpt and inadvertently remove the exculpatory evidence that would have made it look like Brett Kavanaugh may not have done anything. Steve, it's the New York Times, so who are you going to believe? You know, the New York Times or your own lying eyes? Yeah,
the New York Times has gone to the Ferris Bueller level of corroboration here. It's my best friend's sister's boyfriend's brother's girlfriend heard from this guy who knows this kid who's going with the girl who saw Brett whip out his penis at 31 Flavors last night. I guess it's pretty serious. I practiced that. Anyway. I thought you just talk like that all the time, so it was easy for you to do.
No, my wife would have left me years ago if I did that all the time. And rightly so. I think she'd be more worried if I spoke like that than if I were going to parties and whipping my penis out. The New York Times did what I believe they set out to do. Yeah, they had to issue an embarrassing correction and all that, but if your goal is to sow doubt and discord about a Supreme Court justice whom you hate and think is unworthy of the job, and you hate his decisions that he hasn't even written yet and all the rest, if your desire is to sow that doubt and discord about Brett Kavanaugh, they accomplished that. Yeah, okay, you know, embarrassing correction and all that, but it doesn't matter. What are we talking about 3 days later, 4 days later, probably for weeks, months, maybe the rest of Brett Kavanaugh's Supreme Court career? We will be talking about the time that story came out that maybe the Supreme Court justice, when he was a college student, got a little wild at a couple of frat parties. That's their job is done. They smeared the guy. They meant to do it. I firmly believe this. They did it, and if they have to apologize for it and issue a correction, well, it's just part of the price you pay for doing the good work of smearing a guy's good name. And think about that for a moment. When the newspaper of record, the newspaper that all the other newspapers look up to and follow their lead and all the rest, considers it their goal not to inform, but to sow discord and discontent. Well, Bill Whittle, the Times actually had an opportunity to put this story on the front page. The authors of it, who are also the authors of this book, or reporters at the Times, pitched it for the news hole, as we used to call it in journalism. But it didn't wind up there. It wound up in the Sunday Review, which is more kind of news analysis and / opinion. But in this day and age, Bill, it really doesn't matter what section of the paper something winds up in, because most people are reading it online anyway, and they just click a link, and they don't know what section of the paper they're going to. But the thrust, forgive the expression, of the Times story was that when Max Stier, this Washington, D.C. attorney, brought this story to the FBI, it did not make its way into the public record during the confirmation hearings for Associate Justice Kavanaugh. And so the implication there is that the FBI didn't do its job at following up. Meanwhile, it comes out that the Washington Post had this story, so-called, before the New York Times did, and didn't run it, Bill, because they felt like it was not substantial enough to go into the Washington Post. What is going on with America's leading newspaper?
We all talk about bias, and we talk about all of this. This case doesn't need to be made again. We're now at the level where you have to ask yourself what kind of a person would do this. What actual kind of biped would do something like this? If you're willing to make that kind of smear, to accuse Brett Kavanaugh of something that the victim doesn't remember having happened, then you have so little integrity and character that I cannot imagine a job that you would be suited for. But nevertheless, you've appointed yourself the guardian of the nation's morality and the nation's knowledge base. And so there you go. I don't see any alternative to these kind of things other than having Brett Kavanaugh personally sue them for libel, because the main issue in any kind of a libel suit is malice. That's the hard part to get the conviction. He's a public figure, so he not only has to prove that what the Times printed wasn't true, he has to prove that they knew it wasn't true. That's the malice part, that they libeled him out of malice in order to damage his reputation. If the article in question left out the exculpatory evidence that the victim has no knowledge of this whatsoever, then that to me is absolute evidence of malice. And I think Brett Kavanaugh ought to sue him, and I think he ought to continue to sue him. And I think that this kind of thing tells me more about the people we're up against, at least the higher levels of the people we're up against. These are the most reprehensible, vile people I have ever encountered in my life. Even remotely, I feel filthy being associated with. They make me ashamed to be an American. And while it doesn't rise to the level of other famed New York reporter Walter Duranty, because he suppressed information that got millions of people killed, it is, in fact, coming from the same room where they accepted a Pulitzer Prize for a guy who basically filed false reports, saw the dead bodies, but was so left-wing he decided, well, we don't want to bias people against what Stalin's trying to do here. So yes, it should be called the Duranty Daily. That's what we should call this rag from now on, the Duranty Daily. And their job is not to report the news. Their job is to suppress the news, amplify the news, and when necessary, invent the news. So a lot of reputations are being destroyed here, and they think that they're destroying Brett Kavanaugh's reputation, and to some degree they have. Blasey Ford should be sued for perjury, or prosecuted for perjury, actually. But the reputation that's actually being destroyed is the reputation of the New York Times. And even left-wing editors know this. Even the editors at the Post understand that this story was so weak that they wouldn't run it. But the fact that the Times ran it and the fact that it didn't make the front page is, again, to me, evidence of malice. They're saying the editorial, remember those layers of fact checkers and editors that the newspapers have that ensure accuracy in reporting. If the defense is that these guys made a mistake and didn't catch it, and it was originally in an article written by New York Times reporters, then the fact that they put it on the back page is an indication that they didn't have enough confidence in the veracity of the story to put it on the front page. But the fact that they ran it knowing that it wasn't strong enough to run as a news item is evidence of malice. And that's just simply what I would do with it. I would sue them to the end of time, and I would never stop suing them. And it doesn't matter what the amount of the money would be recovered. It doesn't matter. What we're finding is that when we finally respond with legal action against these kind of vile, baseless character assassination attempts, We find that people like Oberlin College are not quite so eager to make those kind of accusations anymore, having lost a lawsuit to the tune of $30 million, which Oberlin College is going to feel. If you're a donor, alumni of Oberlin College, and you've given $2 million to Oberlin College over the course of your life, you have the satisfaction of knowing that all of that money that you've donated has now gone to these people who deserve to have not been slandered and libeled in the first place.
Well, somebody got an education there. I think it was the board at Oberlin College, actually. They were taught a lesson, so to speak. You know, there are a couple of people here that deserve a little praise. Number one, the Washington Post, for getting a story like that they refused to run because it was not substantial. It didn't have the kinds of checks that you would expect to go through as a journalist to make sure that a story is legitimate. Number two, the authors of this book, I'm not going to mention the title of it because I'm not trying to help their book sales, but they are New York Times reporters, and the story that they wrote in the Times gave the full-orbed account of this college incident that Max Stier reports or claims that happened with Brett Kavanaugh as a young man. On the other hand, I find it interesting that the reporters then tried to, number one, defend their editor by saying, well, they were probably, hastily trying to put the story to bed as we went to deadline. It's the internet. If you miss the printed paper, what's the harm with a story that wouldn't fit in the news hole anyway if you hold it till next week? I mean, it's something that happened, 30 years ago, if it happened at all? So the other thing that I thought was curious was these reporters who wrote this book said that they included the exculpatory evidence because they felt that the story deserved its full-orbed treatment, so to speak. Now, as I read the story, you've got a single source story with no corroboration. Even the woman alleged to have been part of it won't talk about it, and her friends tell you that she doesn't remember it happening. Putting an accusation in, followed by exculpatory evidence about an event that you have no corroboration for, is not a story at all. It's something that used to be called gossip, and nobody who had a legitimate journalism credential would be seen writing a story that they couldn't do that. My heroes when I went to journal school back in the good old left-wing days at Penn State were Woodward and Bernstein. And you know what I loved about Woodward and Bernstein, at least in the popular portrayal of them? Every fact that they got, they tried to nail down by getting a corroborating witness who could verify that what they were saying was true. And there's a great deal of focus on this in the book and in the movie about how, wow, we certainly can't go to press unless we can get somebody else who can go on the record to say that really happened. Here we are at the New York Times saying, let's just run an uncorroborated accusation that the person who was the alleged victim has no recollection of. And then, but by putting the whole story out there, including the exculpatory evidence, therefore somehow we've committed legitimate journalism. Bill, if Justice Kavanaugh does decide to sue the New York Times, you're right, he's a public figure. There's a higher standard for being able to prove that. And he does have to not only prove that they ran something that was libelous against him, but that they knew it to be so. If I were the publishers of the New York Times, my defense would be, Justice Kavanaugh, I can honestly say, we don't know what the truth is. We can't be held accountable for that. For Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making Right Angle possible.